can I steal a moment of your time before this episode plays? Thanks so much for listening to Labours of Sports Coaching. The appetite I see for the blend of academic and practical coaching conversations happening on the show is nothing short of amazing, and I'm determined to make this show bigger and better. Now, to help with that mission, please can I ask that you follow and rate the show 5 stars wherever you're listening. This takes maybe 10 seconds and has a massive effect on increasing the show's visibility, and as a result of that, its potential for future growth, which ultimately will enhance your return as a committed listener. Also check out the show support links for anyone looking to offer that extra bit of backing. There's much more to come for Labours of Sports Coaching, and I thank you for joining and driving our new community. And with that, enjoy this episode. Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Labours of Coaching with me, Mark Carroll. So in this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr Colum Cronin. Colum is a senior lecturer in physical education and sports coaching out of Liverpool John Moores University, and he is charged with the agenda of putting the care back into coaching. So Colum, it's great to have you. How are you?
Yeah, very good. Very excited for the chat. Nice to have a bit of time to talk coaching.
Yeah, I think the first place I want to start is, why do you care about care? So it would be quite interesting just to, because you've obviously researched extensively on this. You've even written a book, an excellent book, which I had the joy of reading over the last 2 days, Care in Sports Coaching, that was released back in 2018, and you've done a lot of research prior to that, after that. But it's a whole field in itself, and what motivated you to join that area and actually be a real spearhead for the work that's been done in this area as applied to coaching?
Yeah, thanks Mark first for having me on, and for focusing on care and coaching. It's something I've researched now for probably maybe 7-8 years, from different perspectives. And the reason why I did that, and why would I dedicate a lot of my time towards that topic, is that I kind of came to that topic through a study of coaches. This was a study of youth coaches whose athletes were performing at kind of international level, basketball, athletics coaches, male-female coaches, and one of the things I realized in that study, and which formed the basis of the book, with my co-author Kathy Armas, credit also goes to Kathy, who was a fantastic contributor there, was that many coaches are caring as part of their everyday activity. It's something that they're already doing. It's something that they spend a lot of time doing. But care is not a term we've used to describe that work, and it's not a term we've associated with coaching. Traditionally coaching has been associated with probably, competition. It's associated with toughness, authority, kind of these kind of almost hyper-masculine environments. And particularly if you think about international sport and you think about national teams, for example, and European championships and Olympics, we're talking about very serious coaching and things like that there. Yet actually behind the scenes, there's an awful lot of care taking place. There's conversations between coaches and athletes. Coaches are planning athletes to meet, planning sessions to meet athletes' needs. Coaches are drawing on different expertise to meet the needs of athletes. Coaches spend a lot of time before and after sessions thinking, what's that athlete need? Inferring what the athletes needs, maybe reading some literature about what athletes particularly need, maybe from a technical point of view or a tactical point of view, or going to a conference to find out about the physiological needs. And then they're acting upon those needs. They're designing sessions to meet those needs. And as I said, pulling in resources, planning. So I think that's a lot of care work, because it's basically a lot of observation, a lot of dialogue, a lot of planning, and then a lot of acting to support somebody and to help them to thrive. But we've never really talked about it as care, yet it's integral to what we do. The kind of research around care was then to go, well, hang on, if this is essential to what we do, if this is the essence of what coaching is about, understanding people's needs, working with them to meet those needs, putting things in place to support them and to care for them, how come we don't use care as a term? Because it's actually essential to what we do. Now, it's not the only thing that we do. Coaches do other things. They work with different people. They try to prepare people for challenges to come, whether that's in a competition in a week's time or in a 4-year cycle. So they do lots of other things as well. But one of the things that I think is essential is looking at people's needs and then acting to support those needs. And I think coaches are doing this every day of the week, but we've not really used that term or conceived of it in a caring sense. And that's where kind of the stimulus for that research came. Any of that makes sense, Mark? Does that resonate with you maybe?
No, completely. And it's quite interesting because you paint quite a proactive picture of care in everyday coaching practice, and I'm interested to know, what is the state of care in coaching? I mean, is there trends that we can speak of around this? Where do we see care? Is there enough of it? Does it depend on where we're speaking about care? What's the landscape actually look like?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because some of it comes down to how do we conceive and define care. And there are different ways in coaching that we can do that, for example. So, for example, the most obvious way is the legal safety duty to care. And that's actually possibly the most important way as well, because when that goes wrong, and all too often it has gone wrong, then what we see is athletes and sports and families suffer. And this is across numerous sports now. I think, in the UK where we are today, for instance, Mark, it would, a lot of sports will be able to point to incidents, scandals, examples where that legal duty of care to protect people, whether that be physically, to protect them, maybe from overtraining, maybe from psychological abuse, sexual abuse. A lot of sports can point to examples where that has failed, and therefore we need to do a better job of making sure that's in place. And that's not just the UK problem, Mark. We can see examples right across the world. So that's probably the first version of care, and possibly the most important version of care. And that we see is kind of that legal duty. Do our sports, do our coaches take reasonable steps to prevent harm to athletes? And that might be, as I say, making sure that we're not overtraining, making sure that we are not involved in emotional abuse, or no athletes are subject to that, making sure that sexual abuse cannot happen in our sporting environments. Do our clubs, do our organizations take reasonable steps to prevent reasonable harm and make sure that doesn't happen? So that's the first legal duty of care. My work has probably moved beyond that. Well, not probably, it definitely has moved, but that's not to say that that isn't the most important form of care, is kind of preventing harm and non-malevolence, so not hurting somebody and not harming somebody. My work has kind of moved towards care in terms of, okay, we absolutely need to not harm, but how can we help? And my conception of care that I've mainly drawn on is by a care theorist called Nell Noddings. And she argues that care is a form of labor, which is a nice link to the podcast here. It's a form of labor that is often undervalued, overlooked, done maybe even taken for granted. It's an ethical form of labor where, as a carer, you look and you engage with the cared for, let's say the coach and the athlete, you consider their needs. And I think that's important. What do they need? And together you work to meet those needs. Now that for me resonates so much with coaching. We might do literally, and we might do a psychological needs analysis, or we might do a physiological needs analysis. What does a right back need to play, international football for Scotland physically, for instance? Yeah. So we literally have that language as part of our everyday term, needs. What we tend to do in sport and we tend to do in coaching, I think, is we tend to adopt more of a scientific rather than a social language around that. So as I said, the needs analysis, and we tend to go scientific measuring that. And that's absolutely fine. But what I'd like to do is couch all of that in terms of a social and go, well, okay, what does this player need to help them get to where they want? Let's have a dialogue with them. Let's come up with a plan together and let's see that plan. Let's draw on resources if we need extra skills that are outside my scope of practice, and let's work to support that athlete. Well, that's a form of care. That's, spending time. Just like, for example, a nurse in a hospital would observe a patient and look at their needs and then come up with a plan to support their needs and probably do it through dialogue with the patient. Or just like a primary school teacher would look at a children and go, right, what does this child need in terms of, I don't know, emotional support or English or maths, or, and then say, right, let's put a plan in, let's put some lessons in to help that child flourish. So we have this process here, this caring process that I think a lot of coaches are probably doing. We just tend to couch it more in scientific terms rather than that social, ethical approach to in care. And I think if we can shift our language and shift our conception a little bit, we realize that actually coaching is one very careful activity. So lots of people are doing this work, but also that work is a form of labor that should be valued and it should be rewarded because it does make a difference to helping people flourish. A lot in that, Mark.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. No,
I
it's been. I was just really enjoying listening to it. So what I would love to do, but because there is, as you say, there's so far from just you speaking, just in that moment there, we're bringing out themes around the core requirements for care, but also maybe the benefits that extend beyond that of caring. You also speak to care as a sort of relational enterprise, and then we're seeing care now as a science, and how that reacts perhaps with the maybe more traditional view of care that perhaps Noddings is put forward. So I'd love us to maybe talk to each of those points at a time. So if I can come back to what you'd mentioned about the absolute obligation, but and the absolute success of coaches remembering the core duty of care that they have to whoever's under their charge to look after them, protect their well-being. But what I've been interested in, and this is why I've enjoyed doing some of the research before today, is that beyond the legal requirements of care, there seems to be wider benefits to caring that coaches should look at that is more to help with the coaching process rather than just per se keeping themselves out of hot water and looking after the athletes in that duty of care. So I mean, there's research now to show that like caring climates have been associated with things like more enjoyment, persistence at the tasks, commitment, empathy, even hope and happiness has been measured, and there's been correlations with care. Sportsmanship, it's negatively related with antisocial behaviour. All these sorts of things, and even negative related with things like sadness and depression, that we know for the good stuff that it can bring about, the adaptive outcomes are only going to help a coach work with an athlete and achieve more success with an athlete. And then the flip side with the stuff it's negatively correlated with, and this is just to kind of give a shout out to this is work from like Fry and Gone Overway and Newton and those sorts of colleagues, that we see that coaches shouldn't just care about care for the legal aspect, they should be caring about care for the coaching aspect. And do you think enough coaches recognise that? Because that's what's interesting to me.
So that's fascinating. That idea of, do coaches recognise that what they are engaged in is essentially a caring activity, if they're doing it well, for instance. And that's where I think bringing the language of care forward and asking them and saying, right, How well do you know your athlete's need? How do you know your athlete's needs? Are you acting upon those needs? For example, and are you evaluating whether you're meeting those needs? Like that might stop some coaches in their track and go, well, actually, I'm doing part of that, but I'm not sure I'm doing all of that. And so I think bringing that language forward might help people to think about, okay, this is a caring activity. In terms of the benefits of that caring activity, if we think about, for example, how well do we know our athletes' needs? And if we take a caring approach to that, a couple of concepts from Noddings that might help us. One here is the idea of inferred needs. So an athlete, a coach might read some literature and says, right, a centre midfielder needs to be able to run X amount of kilometers in a match, for example. So we need that capacity to do that, so they might infer that. And they might even observe an athlete and think, oh, they seem really tired and late in games. Okay, so they might infer this athlete needs more training, for example. So that's an inferred need, and that could be useful. It could be based on literature, it could be based on observation, for example, as I said. Noddings also challenges us, though, and this goes to your point about it being relational. Noddings also challenges us to use dialogue, though, and talk to that athlete and maybe make a space so that they can talk to us. The dialogue is both directions, not just one way. And so we go, well, how did you feel during that game? How do you feel about your physical capacity, for example? And that dialogue might then allow the athlete to express their needs. And it may be they say, actually, I'm struggling in the last 10 minutes of games. And you go, brilliant. By expressing those needs, one, they've confirmed what we were inferring. But two, doesn't that open up a great opportunity to go, brilliant, I think I can help you with that. What do you think about this? Or what do you think about that? Or what do you think would help you with this? Okay, I can do that. I can put on some extra sessions. I can maybe increase the distances of our activities to help you get more capacity for longer running. Or we can do this, or we can do some work with the S&C, or we can bring in the S&C. So by having that dialogue in a caring relationship focused on the needs of somebody, and by listening to somebody, it automatically takes you to a conversation where you then start planning how we can meet those needs. And I think of things like individual action plans in football academies, for example, or I think of individual sports where you might have a really close coach-athlete relationship, for example. And I'm thinking, well, actually, let's get that dialogue going to confirm those inferred needs. And sometimes they might dispel those inferred needs, go, actually, you know what? It's not my aerobic capacity that I'm struggling with. I'm really struggling with my emotions because we were 3-0 down. It wasn't that I was tired, it was that I was disappointed. So we go, all right, so maybe it's not aerobic capacity we need to work on. Maybe it's a psychological skill we need to work on, for example. So you could, in through that dialogue, either confirm or elaborate or refine an understanding of people's needs. And then coaches are then better placed to plan activities, use resources to help those athletes to flourish. As I said, by doing it through dialogue, you're also better placed to have the athlete buy in to the activities and the plans, and not even buy into the coach's plans, but to actually devise their own plans about what they're going to do to help themselves develop. So you into this scenario where coaches are now maybe feel more that they're in a partnership with an athlete. Athletes feel that their needs are being met, their voice is being listened to. And crucially, I think that can be really sporting needs. I think a lot of people automatically go to social and emotional, but these can be technical. It could be an athlete saying, I'm struggling with, a technical skill, dribbling in basketball. Okay, well, great. And coach saying, I know somebody who's really good at that. If I arranged a session, would you work hard with them? Yeah, I'd love to do that. Great. Let's arrange that extra session and work hard. So you get this technical development possibly, or you could get physical development. The key point here really isn't the incident of what develops, it's the process that, if it's done well, a caring relationship should involve a partnership working to the athlete's needs. And now that's going to help their motivation, their relationship with their coach, their development, maybe their sense of competence as their needs get met as they develop over time. So I think that's helpful for us, is to use those care concepts of inferred and expressed needs and dialogue. And that's maybe through that you get those other benefits that you were talking about, maybe motivation, maybe sense of competence, maybe sense of relationships and relatedness, because they feel like they're in it together. Mark, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the thing that's jumping out to me that I find really interesting is that you almost can't separate that relational component, or perhaps, and correct me if I'm not using the correct language, but that sort of, what is it, engrossment, the sort of Nodding's approach to conceptualizing the caring aspect of coaching. When you're speaking around how you operationalize that, there's so much autonomy getting put within that. And now I bring that up only to kind of see what you think around what's salient there, because I know that a lot of people that will be listening, it's not going to be the first time that they hear about the importance of gauging an athlete, their perspective, and trying to get their input. But what I'm noticing now, and I see this trend coming out when I've been reading your work and other work that's connected to it, because, like, as you spoke to earlier on, there's many sort of conceptualizations of care. There's the Nodding's view of it. There's self-determination theory view of care. There's actually, duets, sort of 3 C's plus 1, where it's all about, what makes for a functional coach-athlete relationship. And we always seem to come back to the need to give that input, but it seems like you're still talking about input, but from the care side of things. So if we're talking about autonomy, we always talk about autonomy having an indirect impact perhaps on, like, the need to feel cared for, that need for relatedness. It seems like more and more nowadays we're actually starting to go, you know what, being caring or trying to satisfy that need for relatedness, that need to belong, that is what perhaps is helping with competence, and that's what helps with autonomy. So it's like autonomy and competence can be aided indirectly through relatedness, and not the conversation always being about how you can give athlete input and how autonomy indirectly helps with competence, and what's salient in that relationship.
I think you're better placed than I am to talk about it from a self-determination perspective, and which is a psychological perspective, and you're looking at the interaction between autonomy, relatedness, and competence.
Just sorry, because I say this, and we, for example, when you're talking about giving an input, and then that in turn shows some level of interpersonal involvement, that in turn also communicates confidence in an athlete's capacity to take on input and to take charge of their own ownership. But now, actually, if you look at giving them input and having that relational aspect being salient, that in turn is aiding competence, because it comes through collaboration now, because now they're interacting with people, and they're also more likely to get positive feedback in those interactions. Having resources now that they can use, and people and the coach, it's now going to impact their ability to be autonomous. So, like, we're starting to see all these things start to come together.
Yeah. And there's a couple of things that come to mind, and we haven't covered climate, and Laurie Ganover, where his work, Leslie Fisher's work. So we'll come back to that as well. So we do need to come back to that last question. But in the meantime, I suppose a couple of things that come to mind. The first one is this idea of involving the cared for in their care. And I think there's a couple of things that come to mind here. The first is the cared for, let's say the athlete in this case, they have knowledge that coaches don't. And it can be tough for a coach to admit that, because coaches often have to put on a front that they've got all the answers. Because if you admit that you don't have all the answers, well, other athletes might doubt you, parents might doubt you, the performance director who employs you, or the chairperson who employs you might doubt you. So you kind of have to put on a confident, assured front. But actually, we don't know how athletes are feeling. We might infer, I think they look tired, I think they look stressed, I think they look excited or overconfident or arrogant, okay? Or we might even sympathize. If I was in that situation, I'd feel deflated, or I'd feel excited, or I'd feel whatever. So, but we don't know. The person who knows is the athlete. So they know how their body feels. They know what they are thinking. They know what they saw. And we can infer, but we can't really know for certain. So they do have knowledge that we don't have. So straight off, there's value in appreciating them and valuing their knowledge and listening to that knowledge and their thoughts and their feelings and their ambitions straight off. Now, that doesn't mean that the coach doesn't have knowledge. Usually the coach is more experienced. Usually the coach has been through coach education or informal learning, which means they might have more knowledge. They're usually in a really good position, maybe high up or at the side, or not stressed to see a bigger picture going on. So the coach has knowledge that the athlete doesn't, and the athlete has knowledge that the coach doesn't. So if you start from that basis, it's not one or the other dominating the relationship, because both have something to give. Now, that's from a kind of a knowledge perspective, but from an ethical perspective, and remember, care theory is kind of rooted in kind of, moral and ethical relationships, be that in social work or nursing or education. Well, from a moral and ethical perspective, we shouldn't be looking to have athletes undertake activity without their consent, for instance. I mean, as researchers, we wouldn't do that. We wouldn't take somebody into a lab and run a VO2 max test without saying, this is what it's about and this is why we're doing it, and do you agree to it? For the coaches, there's an element of consent here that we need to involve, So, without that, then we might think we're doing the best thing for that athlete. But without that consent, it's not caring, it's controlling. And without their input, it's likely to be based on our inferences, not a shared understanding that both parties have agreed and consented to. So care then would involve athlete dialogue and input from a moral perspective in terms of consent. So that's where maybe autonomy would come in, It would also involve athletes' input from kind of a knowledge perspective, because the coach doesn't have that knowledge. And probably a third one here is that actually, if it's to be truly caring, then the relationship should be both ways. So the athlete should be giving something to the coach as well. Now, that doesn't mean the athlete has to support the coach in terms of their development, but the athlete might turn up to a meeting. It might turn up enthusiastic, or the athlete might turn up and make notes, or the athlete might try to work on the agreed actions. But if the athlete's not giving that, that's not a relationship. That's the coach giving lots and the athlete taking, but not necessarily giving anything back. So there's a danger that if it's not a partnership, if it's not a partnership with consent and dialogue, and it's not agreed, there's a danger on one hand that it becomes really controlling, where the athlete is servile to the coach, and there's dangers like that. But that can also work the other way around, that the coach is servile to the athlete, but the athlete's not giving anything back. So a caring relationship is both ways.
Does that perhaps explain why coach-athlete relationships break down? Because there's a dysfunction to that the coach tells the athlete does, and I'm looking at that and going, well, if the relationship's established in a point of care and a point of consent, the athlete is then accountable for that, and their goals have been included within the conversation. So maybe they're going to more volitionally engage with whatever the process has been, because they've been part of it. The coach is also maybe not going to be walking on eggshells so much, because come back to the legal aspect of coaching, and it's something that going back to the duty of care and that core expectation of coaches to look after athletes and not allow athletes to come to undue harm. If we don't discuss the importance of consent in coach-athlete relationships, we are creating the very problems that as coaches we're terrified of, because we're walking into an environment where it's a landmine sometimes, and you don't know how to navigate it.
Yeah, and this is maybe one of the reasons why we need to bring this care language into sport and into our coaching, and consent, to bring it to the forefront and dialogue. But you've just reminded me of kind of 2 or 3 things there. One of the things we have seen in some research, published by a colleague of mine, Colin Lewis here at John Moores, is this idea of coaches, they say that they care, but they don't. So this was research based on kind of athletes' perspectives of care. And I think we saw the same thing as well from Sierra Morris did some research in the United States around this, where, you have to authentically deliver on this talk then. And that might be one of the reasons why coach-athlete relationships break down, where there's a lot of talk about, oh, we're a caring club, we care for the athlete, we care for this. But then athletes feel, well, actually, you said that, but when it came to it, we didn't have support for injuries, or you didn't develop me, you only looked after the superstars, or I didn't have much dialogue with you, actually. So you see instances like this, and that might contribute to one of the reasons why athlete in coach relationships break down. It could also go the other way, where coaches are doing a lot of care, a lot of planning, a lot of needs, a lot of work, and athletes aren't giving back. And we also see a lot of coach burnout. We see a lot of coach fatigue. I'm just thinking, typical grassroots coaching at this time of the season in football. I know you're a football man, Mark, so I think that example, but there'll be a lot of football coaches out there now. It's nearly April. They're thinking, will the season end? I could do with a weekend off. And you think, right, well, are the athletes giving stuff back to the coach to keep them enthusiasm? Is there infrastructure of care around the coach where somebody can cover and give them a weekend off and say, listen, you know what, it's Easter weekend this week, we've got a game off, so don't worry about training on Thursday night. I'll cover it and you can have a whole week off, for instance, So maybe the coach athlete breaks down because the coach is struggling at the other side, not because the athlete. So we got the example of they say they care, but they don't. Athlete, and therefore leading to breakdown. But we also have the example of the coach giving loads. And as I said, care is a form of labor. You mentioned engrossment, so that's paying attention to athletes, making notes about what you think they need, planning sessions, bringing in resources to do that. That's a form of labor, and it's often unpaid, overlooked, unrewarded, maybe not sustainable. So we have to look after our coaches, and that might be a reason why coach athletes break down. So from both sides. And then, of course, if you bear with me on this, one last one is that coach athlete relationships may come to an end. Deselection, new contracts, leaving a club, the coach or the athlete. Maybe the coach gets the new job, maybe the coach's contract isn't renewed. But my argument is, when those processes happen, when athletes transition to new teams or transition out of sports, or coaches do that, my argument would be that difficult process is best done within a caring relationship, where we've built up trust over time, we've had dialogue, we've worked through processes together, and we can sit down and go, well, this is where the next one is. This is where the next stage, and the next stage is for us to part ways. But this is what I've learned, and thank you for what you've given, and thank you for what you've given, and right, let's go separately. So athlete coach relationships will over time cease and break down and slow down. But isn't it better that happens within a caring relationship than one which was controlled from either party?
Because it's funny, because like and it is, to some extent, this is anecdotal, but where, like you mentioned, deselection, I suppose one of the main things that you typically find when it's the affected athlete is that it wasn't done in a caring way, or they feel blindsided in some respect, and that's probably the accumulation of micro behaviours that where perhaps care's been neglected, or it hasn't been explicitly checked, and maybe we can come back to that in a moment, but where the caring role is maybe subverted to maybe what we would see more typically as the coach's main job, which is technical skill refinement and these sorts of things, but they aren't appreciating that if you aren't looking after the relational aspect of the role of the coach, that it's one, going to damage maybe the athlete's potential to perform and engage in that learning process as meaningfully as you want it to, but also if it's not a slow sort of degradation in the relationship, that when it ultimately does come to an end, what are you going to be known by, and how does that impact your reputation and all these other things? But I wanted to come back to, you'd mentioned about sometimes that coaches need to be overworked, and I wonder, does that come from an uncertainty that perhaps again could have been avoided if coaches were more explicit in trying to validate have they been caring? One of the things that intrigued me when I was reading some of your work, Colum, was the reciprocal part of it that you've spoke to a little bit already. But in that caring conversation, could you maybe speak a little bit to the idea of checking that care is being received? Because I think that we assume a lot, and is that maybe to our detriment?
Yeah, you got 2 or 3 great points there, Mark. I will come to the reciprocal and the checking. Just before that, I think your point about the coach-athlete relationship is really interesting to me, and I don't think we've looked at selection enough yet, and how that would influence care. So depending on your sport, for example, selection might be done by a governing body rather than a coach. So let's say your sport is one measured in inches or centimeters, or to be more precise, or seconds, for instance. Well, there's probably a time you need to hit, and you might be selected by a governing body based on whether you hit that time. So therefore, it's possibly easier to have a caring relationship with your coach who's not in charge of your selection. That might be more difficult in, let's say, a football context or a rugby context or a basketball context, where playing time might be decided by the head coach, for instance, or contracts might be decided by the head coach. So then we start thinking, well, in those environments, is it likely that I'm going to have a caring relationship with that head coach? Or am I more likely to have a caring relationship with the assistant coach or the S&C or the sports psych or the positional coach? Or do we have individual player development coaches that I might have a really good relationship? So I think the context of the sport and the structure of the sport, the context of the season, what the athlete wants and needs, an athlete coming towards retirement versus an athlete who's, on their way through it at a younger age, for instance. That means that what counts as caring coach-athlete relationships, that can be very contextual. And what I would probably encourage is not an attempt to one size fits all, but for maybe people to take these concepts and to look at their organizations and go, right, who's best placed to understand athletes' needs? Who's best placed to bring dialogue in? And to use those concepts, which takes us to confirmation of care. Are we confirming that we are meeting athletes' needs? And if not, that opens up a learning cycle. All right, well, what could we have done differently? What can be done differently? So I'd encourage people to maybe look at their organizations and look at how care can be best done in that context. Because the needs are going to be very different, and who's best placed to meet those needs are going to be very different depending on sport, domain, grassroots versus high performance, age. So the incidental features of how it's done needs to be decided for the context, but the principles of focusing on needs, having relationships based on consent, acting upon those needs, then considering how that can be done. I think that's a contextual thing that listeners can think about. And one other thing before I come back to the confirmation was this idea as well. I think a couple of colleagues here, Annie Newland, Jill Cook, and Amy Whitehead again, at John Moores, we've worked on a little bit on coach-athlete relationship in football. One of the interesting things is, and I'm sure other people would agree with this as well, it's not just us, by the way, is that sometimes the coach-athlete relationships get seen as a separate topic to technical and tactical or physical, or performance. They're separated out. And maybe that's the structure of universities, where we have different departments or different disciplines. We've got, physiology discipline, which publishes in physiology journals, and we have a social discipline or a psych discipline, which publishes in psych journals, and so on and so forth. But really, these things are entwined. The technical development goes hand in hand with the coach-athlete relationship. So if I've got the ability to help improve a player technically, that player can benefit from a relationship with me and might commit more to it. Equally, the other way around. If I've got a relationship with an athlete where I understand their needs, I'm a really good communicator, I can create an environment which helps them to develop, and they're motivated by, that's going to help them to develop technically. So the technical isn't separate through the coach-athlete relationship. The technical can occur through the coach-athlete relationship, and the technical can enhance the coach-athlete relationship. In a high performance domain, I don't think that many athletes want relationships with coaches who can't help them to improve. The ability to help them improve technically, tactically, physically will enhance the relationship, and it's the other way around as well. The ability to communicate, listen, engage will help your ability to improve them technically, tactically, and physically. So these things are holistic. They're not separate. We have to humanize the people involved and see them as a whole, and not, I sometimes think some of this has come from like a 4-corner model, which I really like in football, where we got a technical, tactical, social, and psychological corner. The key point is all those corners are within the same box. They all influence each other here. I think sometimes people forget that these are in the same box. The coach-athlete relationship connects to the technical and tactical. They're not separate. I don't know. Have you got thoughts on that? Or
yeah,
because I still want to come to reciprocal. We've got to come to reciprocal as well. But any thoughts on those two ideas, really?
Yeah, I think it does speak to that, and it's almost like a double-edged sword here, because on one hand, absolutely I agree that if a player's getting better and ultimately the coach is allowing them to fulfill their dream, then to some extent they could see that as care, and maybe that comes back to a point you made earlier on, that care is a process, and it isn't there's been certain frameworks put forward that sees care as a relational enterprise, but it can also be that the coach cares about the athlete's development. They do things that they think is conducive to helping an athlete, and that's how they show care. I wonder, however, if it seems like a bit of a tightrope, that you can walk down the path of addressing the athlete's needs as an athlete and it may actually start to encroach on their needs as a human, as a person, and as one part of a dyadic sort of a relational enterprise, to keep coming back to Nodden's view of it. And I wonder within sport now that we're at the sort of start of a technological boom, where more and more science is the leader in coaching, and I mean by that is science, the process of prescription, because physiology, technology, these things, that there's more and more evidence to show you do this outcome is given. And I wonder, in terms of the future of care in coaching, if it becomes more and more technological, more and more physiological, do coaches need to be careful that we stop treating the athlete as a human and more continue to treat them as a specimen that is to be moved, and that comes down to then having implications for agency, implications around the ethics of that and consent and all these things. We can't lose sight of care and the human aspect of athlete relationships. I think we assume that we know better, and we assume that won't happen. But in the trends that we see about how to make athletes better, that is a concern. You can't lose sight of that.
Yeah, I think this does fit in with your point about, the reciprocal nature and confirming that we are caring for our athletes. So are we having that dialogue and those reflective conversations? And, you know, I've heard some really great examples of how coaches can do this. A simple one was, you know, where do you sit on the bus? Where do you sit on the bus to the away game? You know, do you sit with a different player each time? Because you might have 40 minutes there where you can just chat and check in with somebody. Simple things like, you know, are you shaking people's hands at the training ground? Are you looking in their eyes to see if they're tired? Other examples I've heard of coaches who have a tally chart, and they just keep a tally chart of who they've spoken to that week. So, you know, you've got, let's say, a squad of players, and you might have a range of coaches, and you might go, you know what, let's just, you know, take 5 or 6 players each and make sure we all check in with them each week. Player cam is a term I've heard used where, you know, you got 3 or 4 assistant coaches, and you go, tell you what, let's just can you just watch this player for 20 minutes and see how they're getting on? See, and turning up early to training and see how they arrive at training on a Tuesday night. Are they nervous? Are they coming? Are they rushed? You know, do they look hungry? You know, have they rushed straight from school? You know, so there's lots of ways that we can check in and have conversations to confirm that, you know, their needs are being met, and also to maybe confirm that they are contributing to what we've agreed, because it is a relationship they have to give as well. But again, that confirmation, that's so important, because without that, there's a danger that it's not consensual, you know, and they feel alienated, they feel they don't have a voice, and they feel that their needs aren't being met. But also they might have things that we could be doing better, because remember, they've got knowledge we don't have, or they might know something that can help us. So without that confirmation, we're missing that opportunity to confirm that consent, but also to identify things that can be done better, things that can be improved, to remind them of what they're committed to, what we're committed to. So that confirmation really is the beginning of almost a learning cycle, you know, to really check, right, we've been working on this for a few weeks now. Have we had any quick wins? What worked? Okay, but what could we do different? Where do we want to go next? So now it becomes a longer term relationship and a longer term process.
Does it become harder when you mentioned there, Colum, around when you've got, if it's a reciprocal thing, so if the coach is giving and the athlete's taking, but they aren't also, or at least they aren't engaging and showing their part in that caring relationship, I think that's the challenge that a lot of coaches are in, is when you have an athlete who makes it very hard to care for them because of their personality or because of their engagement and other things. Does a caring framework like Noddings, does that, or even a mix of that in some of the work that you've done, is there a way around that? What do we need to change how we approach that? That's the hard part of care. Caring's easy. I know when I'm working with a player, using that word, a coachable player, they listen a lot, they engage a lot. Caring for that player is easy. See, when you're caring for a player who's they seem as if they've got a bad attitude, they don't respond well to if it's criticism or other things. They don't show you. They don't, when you're trying to engage with them, they don't give anything back. That makes care harder. This is the hard part of care and the reality of care.
Well, but isn't that the reality of coaching, which kind of confirms this idea that coaching, one part of it is caring. I suppose a key point to note here is they don't have to consent to a caring relationship, and not all relationships between coaches and athletes have to be caring. They can be transactional. This is what you want. This is what I want. If you do this, I'll do this. You know, what I would say is that also returns us to what is kind of the legal minimum standard definition of care. So I think as long as the coach doesn't have to try to force a caring relationship if the athlete doesn't want to consent to it. It is a relationship. It's both people need to consent. But what the coach does have to do is they do have to make sure they're taking reasonable steps to prevent reasonable harm. They do have to do that minimum legal duty. So as long as the coach is doing that minimum legal duty, they can have a polite relationship, a working relationship, but it doesn't have to be a caring relationship. My argument is you're probably going to get less benefits if you don't have that caring relationship. So I'd imagine, and Mark, I get the impression that you would probably work towards that at least for a little while, and that's maybe where the coach's listening skills come in. But also, their coach's experience comes in. But also, don't forget here, there's a limit as to what we can expect of our coaches in terms of, do they have the skill set to support particular athletes? Do they have the knowledge to support particular athletes? Do we need to bring in outside people? So, for instance, a scenario like that, maybe a sports psych is better support in place to support an athlete. Maybe an S&C is better in place to support an athlete. Maybe an older athlete is better in place to support a younger athlete. So maybe we have to kind of reflect and think, right, okay, who is in place here to support this person? Is it athlete welfare who is better in place to support this athlete? So there are limits as to what we need to expect of our coaches in terms of their skill set and their capacity to care. We also have to respect athletes' right not to have a caring relationship, but to have a pretty straightforward transactional relationship. And in a lot of instances, again, we talk about grassroots, for instance, I don't know, let's say this is 6-year-olds, coming along once a week. It might not be a caring relationship that they need with the coach. What they might need there is to, have fun, be safe, and play with their friends. So not every coach-athlete relationship has to be caring in a nodding sense. Where dialogue and engrossment. I think there's a lot of benefits to that, but I don't think that needs to be universal. We need to look at the context. But coach-athlete relationships do need to meet that minimum legal that these children are safe from physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, for example. Okay, so I think that's an element. We haven't touched on the technology yet.
Well, before we do, I do want to speak more to that. But you've made me think a little bit about not outsourcing, well, partly outsourcing. Did you mentioned around, sometimes maybe the sports psych is there, but I'm thinking, and I read a little bit around this, and when I was looking through your work column as well, and I'm thinking about how coaches could be cunning, and if we're orchestrating as coaches, care doesn't necessarily need to exist. Me, an athlete, I can cultivate a community of care. And I'm wondering if that's something that we should chat about, because they might not get on well with you. Maybe they just don't, because you have a power, and the power dynamics that exist in any coach-athlete relationship aren't always conducive to natural friendships and natural expressions of care. However, teammate to teammate, parent to child, the other actors that are involved in your environment, can coaches use them?
Particularly where selection comes into play again, so it's really difficult for an athlete to open up to the head coach who's not going to select them and say, I'm really struggling with this, can you help me? And that might be a technical point or a tactical point. It doesn't have to be a physical point. It doesn't have to be a psychological or a social point, so I absolutely agree. And then you add in the fact that care is a form of labor, and that coaches have got limits, as anybody does, on their capacity and on their skills, and they've got particular knowledge and particular skills. Well, can they meet every athlete's single need? Probably not. We also need to look after their well-being and their development as well. So now you move into this idea of maybe having a culture of care. And this is something we have looked at, and we've started to do some small work at trying this out. So, Toronto, for example, who's a different care theorist, slightly different to Noddings in her perspective, she talks about organizations where care kind of warning signs that maybe your organization doesn't have a caring culture. That care is only provided when something bad happens.
Reactive, yeah.
As opposed to being proactive and going, right, who's going to look at these people and be engrossed in their needs? What plans are we going to be putting in place to meet their needs? As opposed to doing that in advance, then a reactive. Or care needs are always assumed, so they're always inferred. coaches are always going, right, this is what the athlete needs. This is what the literature tells us. This is what the data tells us. This is what I know from my experience, that this is what they need. That can be powerful, but if it's not ever confirmed through dialogue, if it's always inferred or assumed and never expressed, that's a bit of a warning sign, because we think we might be caring, but we might not be, because we have never confirmed with expressed needs. Care is only seen as the act of actually helping somebody, as opposed to the work getting to know what they need and the work confirming it afterwards. That's maybe a warning sign where, you know, does your organization double check that stuff has worked, that athletes are flourishing, that they got what they need, that they contributed as well, by the way. Don't get me wrong, this is two ways, you know. You know,
and can we see that, see on that, Colin, can we see the remnants of care, and not in a way that's exactly accurate, but as part of confirmation? Like, we're speaking about confirmation here verbally or otherwise, but I'm thinking about, I could see the remnants of care, and if we're talking about trying to build a caring community where athletes perhaps are encouraging one another, I could see that on the park. So I could see the remnants of care in performance. You could see the remnants of caring relationships and communication between teammates on the park. And I wonder if that's something that we should try to, if it's not exploit, but it's again, draw attention towards more evaluative checkpoints for care, and trying to draw and bridge that gap between care and performance, and care is part of the technical and the tactical and part of the overall coaching process. If we can start to imply things more from, imply is maybe not the right word, but, you know, draw on performance metrics that make it real, if at the very least make it real to coaches and make it real to the actors that are involved, so that they understand and buy into that. But
where the technology can come in then. So an important point to remember about technology is not neutral. Everybody thinks technology is neutral, but technology is not everybody thinks that. Sorry, that's a gross exaggeration. Often people think that technology is neutral and it's how humans use it that makes it a good piece or a bad piece. But technology is designed by humans in advance. So it's already designed from a perspective. So I would argue we need technology designed to help us care for athletes and care for coaches. So if we design our technology and our data and our systems with that intention in mind, we might put in, as you said, data checkpoints every 6 weeks, for example, where we can check in with somebody, or we might design notating systems where we can analyze performance, you know, with the particular needs of the athletes in mind, as opposed to providing a one-size-fits-all. So that's where then we can take technology and take it back and go, right, oh, look, we've put this intervention in. They said they needed help with this. We've brought in the help. We've put on the sessions. And look, we've made improvements. But again, let's use that technology in a care-athlete relationship. Often technology is kind of used in a black box scenario where, you know, we did an article with a colleague of mine, Paul Miller, at the University of Cumbria, quite a few years ago now, where he talked about the athlete is often the subject of the technology, and their performance results in the output, but that is not necessarily ever shared with the athlete. So they're kind of like the object, and the output of the technology is the athlete's performance. But let's bring them in and say, look, we've worked with you on this for 6 weeks. We had this dialogue. We've put this in place, and let's look at where you've now progressed to. And bring them in and sit down with them and use that data with them, and then go, right, do we think we can go again? Because care might be challenging them. You know, you're hitting this metric now. Do you think you need to develop even further? Do you think we need to up the intensity? So again, care doesn't necessarily always mean soft or support. It can mean challenge if that's what the athlete needs, and if that's expressed and if it's consented. So we can then go, right, we're going to up this for the next 4 weeks, and let's see how we get on then as well. So we can use the metrics, the technology within a caring relationship, as opposed, Go on, Mark.
No, sorry, Colin. No, it's just
my point was to use the technology within a human caring relationship, and to help that relationship to flourish, and to help to design the intervention and to support people, as opposed to seeing the technology as neutral, and really or using it because everybody else is using it, or using it, because that's what's done. So being critical about, right, how was this technology designed? What was it designed for? How are we using it? How is it enhancing our athletes to flourish, and enhancing them technically, tactically? Because that's ultimately what we're here to do, amongst 3 or 4 other things, is to help them to develop and flourish and to care for their needs. So yeah, I think there's a need for critical thinking. I think Sean Williams has done some work on this as well, that we need to check, is that technology enhancing our coach-athlete relationships, or is it hurting our coach-athlete relationships? And I think some of it can definitely be used to help, but I think that critical thinking is necessary.
Yeah, because it makes me, I mean, we are now getting into this sort of area of this sort of Skynet realm, because this is AI is now going to be taken off, and we need to start to consider a lot of these things now. Like, I mean, I'm thinking about the principle of data in is data out. So one of the things that's always been said around like AI, for example, is that humans design the programming and the information that these language models will retrieve and use, and if you consider that, if we don't see care being, if we don't see prevalence of care in conversations that then finds itself into the algorithms, if we don't see the correct view of care that is perhaps not biased, and that's very hard to achieve because as people, we are biased. You could see language models and things that aren't even used as diagnostic tools within coaching, or technology that's meant to assist the coach to help direct the athlete towards parts of the performance they need to improve, or even just, software that's designed or meant to help start conversations. It may push us towards care in a way that's good. It may push us away from care. It may push us towards the wrong form of care, or at least care that is unidimensional and maybe is more just about the process, further and further about the science of coaching and not the human aspect of coaching. And these are questions that need to be considered, because that is where we're going. That is going to be the coaching is going to be further and further led by technology. I think if we say that it isn't, we will be surprised in if even 10 years time or whatever, where you see more and more information about how technology can further and further assist the coach. But is it going to take away from that human element of coaching that we know is so important?
And I think we've been here for a while. And by a while, I probably mean several hundred years. I don't mean in terms of AI. I think AI, as you said, is bringing this to the forefront. But, we have, a couple of hundred years, well, probably a millennium of technology, from the inventing of the wheel, right through. So we do have, research on this and philosophical work, which is interesting on this. So, for instance, one of the things that you were talking about there is like, if I can give an example, like, an AI, I've seen an AI tool where if we have a problem, we can type in a problem and the AI will scan the literature on coaching and say, look, there's this solution, and this solution, and it'll give kind of 2 or 3 examples of potential solutions, Now, I think that could be really, really useful for coaches who haven't got much time to read literature, who are on the ground, on the ground, and there's a whole load of information out there. But it does depend on you knowing your athlete and doing that engrossment work first, so you can understand where the athlete is coming from, and not just using an inferred need, but have you got an expressed need? And then taking out that action, and let's say there's option 1, option 2, option 3, and you go, right, well, I'm going to go with option 1. Well, okay, that's quite controlling then. Have you taken these options to the athlete? Have we involved them? Have we got them to buy into to one of these options? Have they expressed where they would want to commit to as part of a relationship? So within a caring system, I think that technology could be really useful.
But fit the technology around the athlete and have that process of needs analysis be informed by that engrossment. And is that correct?
Yeah, and other forms of data as well, but dialogue, as a key part of it, consent is a key part to it, both parties committing to the action that you're coming out with and agreeing to, so there is a coach-athlete relationship and elements of care concepts that could make that much more effective. And without that, there's a danger that a coach puts in their perspective, doesn't draw on the knowledge of the athlete, doesn't draw on the consent of the athlete, and says, okay, and the computer says this one, so we're going to go with that one, and imposes that, dehumanizes the athlete then as something to be molded rather than somebody to be worked with in that sense. So, the technology can be used in two different ways there, but it could be productive. Another example, which again, in a lot of cases where we at and have been at for quite a number of years, remote coaching. Athletes, records a performance on their phone, sends it off to the coach, and the coach sends back data. Your velocity was this, or your height was this, or this is how you performed in a rugby match, a basketball match, a football match. X amount of passes. Well, again, are we missing the opportunity to go, this is what I can see. How did you feel? What did you see? And get a wholly humanized account of the experience. If we reduced everything down to passing percentages or distance run, we actually miss the human element of participating in sport. What was the joy, the frustration, the anger, the flow, so again, remote coaching is a great opportunity, but if we reduce it down to sending video and quantifying observable and sending it back, and we miss the effective and the social and the meaningful, why are you participating? How did that feel? Where do you want to go? There's a danger here that, again, we depersonalize what is really, a human experience here, which is participating in sport. But again, sorry, on that.
I've got another example there that's just came to mind as you're saying that. I've been looking into the use of virtual reality within coaching recently, and what you can now do if you actually, as a coach, want to see inside your athlete's head when they're making decisions, is you can literally put a helmet on them now that can show and simulate from thousands of match-like situations that have been put into these computer machines, and there's now a simulation there, and the simulations are fairly valid. There's been some research that's came out recently to show that differences in skill level that were measured in players was able to predict very accurately differences in achievement within these simulators to show it is starting to mimic things. So a coach could go, I can see inside my athlete's head here, and I can start to see what are they looking at to help break down the defence during these moments. But then, if you what you're making me think now, Colin, is that's a great conversation to have, but we can't forget to ask them how they were feeling, what else was going on in these scenarios. So we're seeing something, but we can't remove the person from what we're seeing. The person's flawed. The simulations and what we could expect from is as flawed if we forget that we're working with a person. And then there's the consent aspect of, are we telling athletes now you need to go and put this on and I need to see this, and how does that influence a caring relationship?
Yeah. And what sense did they make of it when they saw it, which might be different to what sense I've made of it, and what memories came to mind, and what was meaningful for them versus what was meaningful for you. But as I say, that could be a great conversation starter, couldn't it?
Yeah.
If we
100%.
remember that what we're about here is caring for humans. If we forget that, and if we depersonalize and dehumanize, then the technology, it can override its purpose, and now we're stripping away the human aspects. Then we're in danger of alienating the athlete. the athlete feeling like, I'm just, a piece on a chessboard being manipulated by a coach, for example. And, so I think technology, data definitely has a place to play, but within care and relationships. And I'd say the same thing about science. And actually, we talked about, who's best placed to care for athletes. Well, it could be S&C, it could be sports psych, it could be physio. I mean, and I want all of them to be evidence-based, informed by science. But they're actually working with people, so I don't want them to forget that. I want them to understand your role here is to help somebody to develop and help somebody to mature. And you can use science to do that. And I want you to use data to do that. But don't forget the bigger purpose here is for us to help athletes to flourish, us to work with them to meet their needs, so they can go on and have positive sporting experiences, positive sporting outcomes in terms of results. So the science needs to be within that big picture, and the data needs to be within that big picture. I don't know if that helps, Mark.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. I'm wondering now, but because it sounds like we're talking about care in more of a performance-focused environment where perhaps these resources are available to us. But can care change depending on where coaching's happening? So I'm thinking across grassroots sport. Have you seen differences in how care is shown or developed in that? Have you seen differences in youth sport versus senior sport? Have you seen, performance-focused sport? How is care, or marginalised groups like disabled athletes or gendered issues around care? I'm wondering about the context of care now.
Yeah, so, this is a really good point, and it makes it difficult at times for me to say what does care look like, because care care isn't just different, it should be different because it's needs-based and it's relationships. So it depends who the people are and what their particular needs are. Care for some athlete, as I said, might be a more intense training program, more challenge. Care for other athletes might be an easier training program. And, care for one athlete might be greeting them at the door. I've seen an examples where this is a back to netball project. So typically this was women who had left netball, maybe they played at uni but stopped, they've gone to work, they've had children, they're coming back in their 40s, and they're nervous walking through the door. Care in that instance is turning up early and greeting them at the door. Care in another context might be saying, look, we're going to do an extra tough run today, we're going to be at lactate threshold, this is not going to be pleasant, but we are going to do this based on your consent. We're going to do this based on a need we've both identified. And if anything goes wrong, we've got medical support around here, to help you. So care in some contexts can be very challenging, and care in other contexts, as I said, could be social. So, it can be a text message. The key point is it should change based on the needs of the participant and their relationship with the coach. And of course, those relationships happen within a context. It's not appropriate for the under fives to be doing lactate threshold type work, for example, it might be a text to an athlete who's receiving loads of abuse on social media, and it might be a text from the coach saying, listen, give me a call, or give so-and-so a call who's an expert on this and who's got really good skills. So it might be signposting. So care is very, very contextual. Depends on who's involved, what their needs are, where they are. Even the time makes a difference here, Mark. Care in pre-season is different than, what's caring for athletes who've just lost the cup final is different to what's caring for athletes in the run-up to the cup final. They're the same athletes and the same level of sport, but the timing is made. So all coaching is contextually fluid. Coaching at halftime after you score a goal just before halftime is different than if you coach after halftime. So is caring for the athletes. If somebody gets sent off just before halftime, that might be different than if somebody on the opposition gets sent off. How do we care for those athletes at different times? So care very contextual, very relational, and that's where I kind of go back to principles of Do you understand your athlete's needs? Are they
Mm.
inferred, or are they inferred and expressed? Are you meeting those needs within your capacity and within your skills, or do you need to bring people in or signpost people where there's limits at your skills? Are athletes contributing to the caring relationship? And if they don't want to, that's okay, that's fine. But are you at least meeting the minimum standards, the requirements, that we're not harming athletes? Doesn't have to be a close caring relationship, but at least make sure that we're not harming athletes. Is the care labor considered at an organizational level? So who's best placed in your organization to care for athletes? Do they recognize that we are in a caring one part of the coaching and helping these athletes flourish is to care for them? You know, are we drawing on their skills and expertise? So the principles, are we confirming care, and are we then learning from those confirmations? Are we proactively planning for care? Yeah, these are the principles that I think coaches can maybe jump on. And if they have time to sit down with people in their organizations, their clubs, their teams, and go, right, how do we do this within our context? And I think that's probably the best way to go. That can be frustrating, Mark, because I'm not very good then at telling people an easy solution. But coaching is complex.
I think that is a solution, Colin, but because the reason I'm saying that is you're mentioning context, but you're mentioning principles as often as you're mentioning context. And maybe we can chat about this, because something I have issue with context sometimes. And actually, you know, it was from previous conversations that we've had, actually, that's made me think more and more about this subject. And when we're talking about the efforts of coaching and those sorts of things, and it's very easy when we see, particularly when we're now talking about how care can be expressed through doing and process and helping an athlete longer term. And and you can think about, you mentioned a lot in your work, the idea of tough love and how we need to think about what that means. But it very easily, context is used as a cop-out for just behaviour that just isn't good and is just harmful. But what maybe is going to help coaches avoid and perhaps police themselves more, and really what tough love is, that isn't just tough but also comes with a love, is the principle. Understanding care in the way that you're demonstrating it through the need of consent, and to understand the needs of the athletes and ensure that it's a reciprocal relationship. That's going to ensure that you can apply that reciprocity and that collaboration to context, so that when tough love is shown, it is still, the love part still there, that it's still caring. Because I think there's this narrative a lot in coaching about context that is useful in one way, but really flawed in the conversation around care, because context, that people aren't understanding that context comes with principle. Principles aren't negotiable. The principles are principles, they're set. They aren't navigating context in a way that's correct, and it's harmful. And it makes me speak to that, and I think that is a solution. I don't think I think that you are giving a solution, because you're bringing the conversation down to what really matters at the crux of it, to not do harm, and that requires consent, and that requires that the real care back into coaching.
Yeah, and I think you've reminded me of a few things there. So the first thing is, we've seen in the White Review, which is an incredibly important report, where, you know, abuse in gymnastics was often justified by, this is what's needed to be at the elite level. And the White Review confirms that that wasn't what was needed, you know. I think Bishop does work on this, where she talks as well about the long win, and start thinking, well, what are we actually trying to do here? If our heroes are subject to abuse, our sporting heroes, these are the people that kids have got their posters up in the wall. And if we're abusing them physically, emotionally, sexually, then what are we doing to our sport? You know, how is that nurturing our sport? How, you know, at the very least, we're abusing those people. We're turning them out of the sport. We're turning other people off. We're perpetuating myths in a sport. So we need to think, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to nurture and grow, you know, people through our sport, trying to grow our sport, trying to have positive outcomes. So I think there are two things that come to mind. So that's why we keep going back to that first one. Actually, duty of care is the minimum. I think your point then that care doesn't mean soft, it means meeting needs, but it means meeting needs within a caring relationship. Where, as you said, consent is there, it's needs based, so it's not just inferred. We've got some evidence, we've got some data that this is what we need to work on. We've got the athlete committed to working on that. And, we're going to confirm and check that this is okay. We're going to wrap some support around. And one of the things that comes to mind here is, and I give this flippant example often, so, is dentistry. I mean, dentistry is brutal. Like, they literally take pieces of metal and put it in your mouth and make you bleed, and inflict pain. They drill, it's fairly brutal stuff. But they shouldn't do it without having evidence that you need it. They always make sure, in my case at least, they always make sure that I sign a consent form. They do a history with me beforehand to make sure I'm safe. Even though my mouth's full and I can't really say much, they tell me in advance, if you need a break, put your hand up, So they do this really tough procedures for our benefit. There's usually, in my case, my dentist, several people involved, so they can come and check, and they can call a more experienced person. And they sometimes run the diagnosis. Can you have a look at these, X-rays? Is this what we're going to go with? Is this the best procedure? They confirm that I'm okay. They bring me back for a follow-up to make sure everything's okay a few weeks later. So there's processes in place there to make sure that even though I'm undergoing a tough procedure, that it's done within a caring context. It's not pleasant still, but it's in my best interest, with my consent, evidence-based, safe. It's not just somebody's inference that this is going to work and you just need to get on with it because I say so. Like that, we wouldn't accept that, or we shouldn't accept that in our medical. I'm looking at, should we accept that in our coaching? I don't know the answer to that. I haven't necessarily delved deep into what that would look like in coaching, but that dentistry example, that medical ethics, it comes, again, you'd see the same thing in an operation. It's literally, cutting people open, for instance, but evidence-based, second opinion, with consent, outcomes, safety nets in place. These are things, that should at least be in place if we are going to challenge people to work at extreme levels, for example.
Yeah. You remind me, I was recently at a symposium in ethics and coaching at University of Stirling, and Andrew Abraham had actually given a speech that did speak to a lot of the points around, when we asked athletes to go on this journey, did they really understand what's coming up, and wherever you can possible, can you check that that they still are okay, and I know people might say, there's probably people listening that might say, but coaching isn't dentistry, and you need to make decisions quickly in coaching, and that's fine. We're not saying that. We need to probably recognise that coaching as a profession, coaching is still becoming professionalised in so far as the different areas within coaching. I know professional sport, of course, has that, but if we want to further progress the discipline, we maybe can learn from more established fields in the question of ethics and of care, health, teaching, those sorts of things. And that need to check in on people's social care. Another occupation maybe we should be, and this might be more a topic for coach educators and developers, that we need to consider how we can draw learning from these other occupations that essentially work with people, that work with the human, and therefore have to ensure they don't become detached from that need to care for that person. I'm wondering, we've probably came to the point now in the conversation that we really understand the need for care. Do we see that reflected in job advertisements? And I just wonder this, because I always remember listening to seminar that you'd done yourself, Colin, a few years back at Crick, and you were looking a little bit around like the advertisements of like, you know, in job specs. Do we see the use of the language of care in those job adverts? When we're attracting people, are we showing, our organisations showing that they care about care? What if you can speak to that? It might be interesting, and I don't know if there's been an update on some of the stuff you found.
Yeah, we did a little bit of work on both this for the seminar. Now we've never published it, and we probably should do. It's on a long list of stuff to do. Where we looked at job adverts at the time, and care basically did not feature. So this was at a time where I and others like Leslie Fisher, as I said, Laurie Gano Overway, were arguing that, you know, care is an essential part of being a coach. You know, you need to understand your athletes' needs. You need to work to meet those needs and help them flourish. But it just wasn't featuring it very much. And when it did feature, it was often in the legal duty sense. So have you got your safeguarding certificate? So at least that was something. It was there in at least the legal minimum standards, reasonable harm, protecting and stopping athletes and taking reasonable steps to prevent reasonable harm. So at least it was there in some of those adverts in that sense. But in most adverts, it wasn't there at all. And even in those ones, there was very little about actually getting to know athletes' needs and then meeting those needs. And ultimately, that's one of the things that I would argue is the essence of coaching, is that, you know, working with athletes to care for them is one of the essences. There are other things as well. You have to prepare athletes for challenges to come that you can't foretell. Competitions, for example, injuries, for example, disappointment, for example, transitions, you know, in and out of sport. So there are other things, you know. You have to work with various people, be that parents as well, agents, you know, staff as well. You have to orchestrate, as you mentioned earlier. And there are other things, you know, such as being able to develop somebody corporally, so their physical, technical, tactical excellence. But understanding and meeting those needs is one of those things. So therefore, I would expect it to contribute at least on job adverts. And the reason why we focused on job adverts was that they were almost a proxy for how people see coaching. And this was a few years ago now. So maybe we've had some impact and maybe it's started to change. But what we're looking at is if people don't see coaching as a caring activity, when it seems to be essentially caring, as well as other things, then there's a danger that the care gets done by those who've worked this out or learned through experience or had caring coaches themselves. But there's also a danger that it doesn't get done because it's not explicit, it's not framed that way, it's not discussed that way. Coaches aren't evaluated and rewarded for caring for athletes. So if they're not evaluated, rewarded, trained, supported, educated to care for athletes, there's then a danger that they don't, because they don't see it as part of the role. So. And we see this in other professions. We see this in education, for instance. Care work is often performed by some members of staff at certain levels, but less rewarded and less expected at other people. We see that gender makes a difference. For example, care work is often left to other people, females in particular, or particular races to perform. So we see this in areas, as you mentioned, social work, for instance. And then other areas, care is not seen as important, not seen as part of the role, and therefore it doesn't happen. So we do need to make it explicit if that's how we see coaching. Which goes back to your point about coaching as a profession. We talk about coaching as a developing profession, mixed economy. Majority of coaches in the UK, at least, are volunteer, significant minority or part-time. I think it was, Bill Taylor, and I think Dean Garrett, who wrote about coaching as a profession in the mid-2000s.
So maybe 20 years ago now, nearly 15 to 20 years ago. And one of the stipulations they had was to have an ethics, an ethical approach to coaching. So for me, this is an ethic of care is one that we should consider. I don't think it's essential, as I said, I think it's essential that we safeguard. I think it's essential that we're in non-malevolence, as I said. But I think for professional coaches, they might want to think about adopting an ethic of care so they are acting as a profession. And then anybody regulating coaches, for example, through job adverts or role descriptions, might want to think about, okay, what are the ethics that we want to adopt within our profession? So as I said, the essential for me is that we have to adopt non-malevolence. But ideally, we want to go further, understand our athletes' needs and meet them and work with them to do that in a consensual, ethical way.
Yeah. And there's probably two things there that we can I can emphasize as well that you've already spoke to, just to kind of round off the conversation, that you mentioned about that if we don't do more to try and help coaches think more about care, that we are leaving it for coaches to figure it out for themselves. And that then means that you have very good coaches that through experience start to learn how to care, or more often and more likely, coaches who have cared from day one because that's how they were coached in a caring way. And it does bring back into the conversation the importance of being reflexive as a coach, to understand why do you coach the way you coach, because your version of care is probably influenced from maybe how you were coached or how you've learned how to coach. And again, it's just trying to start conversations. The more that we can use the language of care, the more it's going to bring it to the forefront of coaches' minds. And therefore, perhaps, if at the moment we don't have the resource to educate coaches, nationally and through sort of coach education routes around care, we're at least helping coaches figure it out more for themselves, just through priming them to think about it. And I suppose that, and we probably are at the stage where it's a wee bit of opinion, but I always think, and this is a conversation that, and I know your work's not trying to suggest this, but if coaches were to do everything we want coaches to do, there would be an endless array of tasks for them to do. But I think care is one of those ones that, do you know what? There is more to coaching than care, right? But see, if you're a nice person and you look after people, you're doing all right. I think there's a lot of things in coaching that you don't have that can you can compensate for and those sorts of things. But if you don't care, there's always going to be an element to do with the fact that it is a social activity that you're going to lose out on. But just by caring, I think so many coaches can make themselves better coaches instantly just by being a good person. And I don't think that interviews like this need to be about putting more pressure on coaches. It actually is about simplifying your role to some extent as a starting point. This is just about just be a good person. I always see it, and it's something I need to catch myself with if I'm on a game day. I don't see myself as coaching on game days. I see myself as a supporter on game days. I'm trying to support the players, and I know there's more to it than that. And of course I could be doing more than just trying to look after them and praise them and encourage them. But I'm doing a lot by doing that in itself. And I just wonder if there's anything you want to leave the listeners with, Colum. This might be a good opportunity to do that. That's what you've left me with. That's what I'm thinking. I don't know.
Yeah, I think absolutely having these conversations stops and challenges us to think about, right? Do we know our athletes' needs? Are we meeting them? It also reminds us that we have to look after the coach within that relationship, because that takes time and effort. And you're right. A lot of coaches will have learned to do this by having good coaches themselves. But even if you haven't, you've probably had other people in your life, a PE teacher, a parent, a family member, who cared for you. So you probably have examples of people who are good at listening and supporting, so let's use those examples. Let's show more of those examples so everybody understands what it means to be a good caring coach. I absolutely agree with, and we should reward that. We should capture those case studies. Just on your last point, I mean, match days, I'm not particularly good at. I get too caught up and trying to help, to let them play. This is definitely something that I'm working on in my coaching. And you know, if you get a few bad results in a row, or a few things aren't working, or you know, the complexity of coaching is getting you down, you feel overwhelmed, I do find these concepts useful to maybe ground myself and say, okay, right, what's this about? Okay, it's about working with the under 10s team, or it's about working with these academy players, or it's about working with this person who's close to in front. All right, okay, do I know what they need at this moment? Have we decided what our plan is to help them with those needs? And I say we as in they're involved in that. You know, is there stuff outside of my skill set that they need, that I need to refer to? So there's limits as to what I can do, you know. So these concepts are helpful when the chaos of coaching is overwhelming somebody, or you're feeling a bit down, or you've had a few bad weeks and you feel like you're losing your way. Because I think you're right, Mark. I think most people get into coaching because they want to help somebody flourish within that context. So it's useful then to sit down every now and then when you feel like you're losing track of that, or you're not sure, and to go back to the basics and go, right, what do we need? Is it in place? Who have we confirmed that? Are we all agreeing on that? Do we need to bring in any expertise? Have we checked that it's working? And these are useful concepts to maybe light the way for a few more weeks ahead and get us back on track. So yeah, hopefully they will help coaches in those moments where it can be overwhelming, and it can be. So yeah, that's useful. Yeah, I hope the conversation has been enjoyable for the listeners. I've certainly enjoyed it. Hopefully they've got principles and concepts. There's definitely more research to be done. We don't have all the answers either. But yeah, thanks for having me on.
No, thanks so much, Colin. It's been an absolute pleasure. So, and hopefully for the readers and for the listeners, sorry, I know that it would have been just as useful for you as it has been for me to think about these things that maybe we sometimes take for granted. And really, as this conversation's shown, there's a lot more to care than just that simple word in itself. Care is an enterprise, and it's a commitment. So let's try and see if we can try and put the care back into coaching, or deepen the amount of care that we do currently give. So thanks for that, guys, and we will see you next time.